So thank you for joining us tonight. This is actually the first session for Gardening for Wildlife. Tonight we'll be talking about how you can create a lovely wildlife habitat at home. My name is Amy Barton and I work for the Clackamas River Basin Council, or CRBC for short. I'm joined by my fellow presenters who are here with us tonight, Susie Cloutier, Lisa Kilders, and Nicole R. from the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, Anya Pickard from the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. Also with us is Morgan Parks and Gray Sorensen with the National Wildlife Federation, and also Christina Peterson from the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, who's not here tonight, but we do have a recording from her. And also Eric Butler, who works with me at CRBC. So before we get started, I wanted to share this with you. Many of us are joining us from Oregon and Washington, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we are gathered here on unceded lands of many Native peoples. So I ask you to join me in acknowledging the many communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We thank those who came before us and for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and into the future. So thank you. And then briefly, just some Zoom etiquette. We, all are pretty used to being on Zoom these days, so we know how it works, but if you could please keep your microphones on mute, that would be great. Also, if you can keep your cameras off if you'd like, this will help us save bandwidth for our presenters and some videos that we'll be playing for you. This will also reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting tonight. And at any time during the workshop, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat. We have lots of Q&A sessions, so we can review all of your questions together. And also stay tuned for a few more polls that we have through the workshop. So now let's go ahead and introduce each of our presenters.
I'm Antanya or Anya, either one is perfectly fine. I work for the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. And the Backyard Habitat Program is a co-managed program between Portland Audubon and Columbia Land Trust. So both organizations are involved and help to manage the program. Portland Audubon is one of Oregon's oldest, largest, and most revered conservation organizations. They work to promote conservation and activism, and they have many education programs, as well as a 300-acre sanctuary open to the public, and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Care Center, and there's a lot of volunteerism that happens there too. Columbia Land Trust is works from throughout the Columbia River Basin, from the Dalles on down to the Pacific Ocean. They've conserved over 45,000 acres, and it has more than 3,000 supporters. And their work is both on the Oregon and Washington side. And the Backyard Habitat Certification Program basically fits into the habitat restoration and advocacy of both organizations. So I am a habitat technician, and I will be talking more about our program later on. So thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Anya. My name is Amy again. I am the Communications and Stewardship Program Manager for the Clackamas River Basin Council. I'd also like to introduce CRBC's Riparian Specialist, Eric Butler. Eric, do you want to say hi real fast? I may have caught him off guard. Oh, there he is. Yeah. So the Clackamas River Basin Council's mission is to foster partnerships for clean water and to improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for those who live, work, and recreate in the Clackamas watershed. And we accomplish this in a variety of ways by undertaking watershed restoration projects on the Clackamas River and its tributaries to increase the abundance, the diversity, and the productivity of native resident and anadromous fish populations throughout the basin. We also do this through protecting and enhancing the quality and quantity of source water for domestic water supplies to meet the increasing population. We work to control non-native weeds and restoring native vegetation to improve both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. We also engage in public education and host workshops such as this to provide the community with the resources that they need to do the same on their own property. So nice to meet all of you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Kilders, and I'm here this evening with Susie Cloutier and Nicole R. And we are from the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District. It's a special district that there's one in every county across the United States. Ours serves the Clackamas County boundary. That's our area. We help people with their natural resource issues, things like erosion or irrigation issues, pasture manure management, oak restoration, riparian restoration, invasive weeds, erosion control. We focus on water quality for the users, drinking water people, as well as people using it for their crops and their animals. And we are thrilled to be here tonight. So if you have any issues, have any problems, give us a call. We have people that can help.
Thank you, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Morgan Parks, pronouns she, her. I'm the Oregon Education Manager with National Wildlife Federation, and joining me is my colleague, Grace Sorensen, who's our AmeriCorps Education and Outreach Coordinator, serving both NWF and our affiliate partner, the Association of North Steelheaders. And we are a voice for wildlife, working to ensure wildlife thrive in a rapidly changing world. And National Wildlife Federation is the largest member grassroots conservation organization in the US. And some folks know us from our mascot or guardian of the wild ambassador, Ranger Rick, in our children's magazines. In Oregon, we focus on advocacy and education with the Northwest Steelheaders, who are a fishing advocacy group. And we have an Eco Schools USA program. We help schools with salmon education through the Fish Eggs to Fry program. We have a Garden for Wildlife and Schoolyard Habitats program. And we also focus on monarch butterfly conservation. Glad to be here tonight.
So we do have a few short videos for you that we're going to be playing. Some of our sessions actually been pre-recorded for you, and some of it is going to be live. So we're kind of trying this new format for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes it's hard to wrangle a large number of speakers into one evening. So we do have a video from one presenter who couldn't be here tonight. And then we also have some live recording or live presentations for you, and also some recordings of from instructors that are going to be here tonight. And our hope is that after we play a video segment for you on a certain topic, we can take a deeper dive into that topic afterwards and give you all plenty of a good question answer time to make sure that you can get the most out of the class tonight. So feel free during the class to just drop your questions in the chat at any time during a video, and then we'll make sure that we get to all the questions and go over them together during our Q&A sessions. So our very next slide is actually going to be one of our first videos. So I'll go ahead and get that queued up for you. So here we go. This is going to be a video of Susie Cloutier. So I'll go ahead and get started. And like I said, please feel free during the video to drop your questions into the chat at any time. And then after this plays through, we'll have a nice little Q&A session and we can all talk together. Okay.
Our goal in this class is really to help you turn this into this. So we want to help folks really change the way that they look at their yards as an integral piece of habitat, something beautiful, a place they want to waste their time in, and a beneficial ecozone. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to help you not only make your beautiful yard, but a healthy, pesticide-free, wildlife-friendly, water-wise, puddle-free yard or property. Or as the author of Douglas Tallamay says, we're going to help you to bring nature home. So the story of humans and our surroundings is not a pretty one. So just hang on for a second. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a rough ride, but one with more knowledge and more power to change the way we see and be in the world each of our little changes can change the world. Next slide. All right, this is a tough infographic, but there are a lot of things leading to wildlife decline. So we've got invasive species, urban sprawl, climate change, human population growth, and in general, the way that we are using and abusing our land. So you can see that it is far reaching. We have global climate change is changing things as strange as, wildlife diseases that are being spread from our domestic animals to our wildlife. We've got our highway systems. There's a lot. Should we be afraid? Yes, we should be afraid. But take heart. Are there things we can do? Heck yes, there are things we can do, and that's why we're here, just so people don't feel hopeless and we can make a change. So let's start with birds for one, since we all know and love birds. 25% of our common bird species are in decline. So as a matter of fact, many of our common bird species alone have lost 50% of their numbers in the past 40 years. Yikes. So birds like barn swallows, American goldfinches, rubus, hummingbirds, flycatchers, warblers, kinglets, meadowlark, that's our state bird, killdeer, mourning doves, house wrens. I won't even start with our insects, fish, and mammal species because we can go all night. So what's causing these declines? It's not one thing, obviously, but it's everything that adds up. For birds alone, and just in our backyards, we can look at things like loss of habitat. I think I saw someone mention earlier that their neighbors have replaced even their natural lawn with plastic lawn. Climate change, man-made hazards, and one of the man-made hazards I think Anya will be speaking about is cats, free-roaming cats, windows, lack of food and shelter. So let's get a little more local. So next slide. For those of us that live in this area, this was a very hard end of our summer. The Riverside fire in the Clackamas burned more than 138,000 acres alone. So that combined with the Lion's Head and Beachy fires made a grand total acreage of burn in 2020 with just these fires of 542,000 acres. So that's 542,000 acres of habitat destroyed in the span of just 3 weeks. So if you think about it, in just one catastrophic event, which we know we'll have more of, we can lose over 500,000 acres of wildlife habitat, along with much of the wildlife that depends on it. So we have some duties here. Next slide. So we live in such a beautiful area of this country. We've got huge mountains and high desert and coast, wetlands, wet areas, dry areas, elevated areas, low areas. And the Portland-Vancouver region sits at an incredible ecological crossroads. It's the confluence of two great rivers, north, south, east, and west migration routes for migratory animals as well. And if we stretch out a bit from our Portland metro area, want to bring a couple of things to note for you. One is that this country has 43 million acres of just lawn. So it's a little bit horrifying. And when we juxtapose that with the 1 to 3% of the entire USA that is considered undisturbed, we can think, yikes, we definitely need to get active. So next slide. So hold on, it's not all doom and gloom. There is hope. Nature is mighty resilient. We know that even with COVID and our slowing down our driving to work and back, that ozone holes started to close, and we've had a lot better air quality. So nature is a resilient thing, especially when we give a little nudge. So though we traditionally think of our urban landscapes as devoid of biodiversity, there are so many bird species and thousands of plant species that can really thrive in the cities when we provide the correct resources. So if you take one thing away from this class, and this is what I tell everybody, I would like it to be this fact, that our native wildlife have co-evolved to utilize our native plants. And what that means is that around 98% of our native plants here in the Willamette Valley are utilized in some way for food, shelter, breeding, rearing, eating, you name it. So by our native wildlife. So these guys have spent millennia growing together. I'm going to give you one other thing. And that's the flip side of it. So only 2 to 5% of those cultivars or those boxwoods or things that you pick up at the nursery or at Home Depot and stick in the ground, only 2 to 5% of those plants that we buy from the nursery or ain't from around here, as I call it, can be utilized by our native wildlife. So we can always argue that, well, I see a lot of bees on my Himalayan blackberry or on my, God forbid, on my butterfly bush. But we need to be very aware that that's one plant out of many that we plant. So lush, wonderful looking yards can be utter biological wastelands for our native wildlife and pollinators. So if we wonder why our yards are really serving all the important native critters, from bugs to birds to mammals, remember those stats. Remember those stats, remember them. Maybe there's one thing that I would like you to take from the class is that you can, and it sounds cliche, but you can be the solution, seriously. Just one person doing one thing adds up to really big things.
Okay.
So
we are done with that one. So do we have any questions other than the one I have that is, will this recording be available after the workshop, Amy?
Yes, it will.
And where will we find them?
I will send out a link when I also send out the survey, and we'll have a resource link page for everybody too. So I'll send it all together in one little package email.
Wonderful. Okay, do we have any other questions before we move on to Anya? Anyone?
I do actually have a poll to share.
Oh, we have a poll. How exciting. Okay.
We do have a poll. So let me get this ready.
I'm talking and you can't even see me. Okay.
And here we
So
go.
tell us about your yard. Multiple choices. You can pick as many as you like.
We've got almost everybody, 70%, 85%. Look at that, almost everybody has participated at this point. So I'll go ahead and share our results with everyone.
All right.
Susie,
That looks good.
yeah,
Go ahead.
I was gonna ask Susie if she had any comments. This was her poll.
Yeah, oh my goodness. I love that 91% of participants have native plants in their yard. So way to go, guys. You are already winning. Obviously that goes, things that go along with that are invasive plants too. And I think that that's a persistent challenge that we'll all have in our yards. But I'm looking forward to seeing what everybody thinks about that lawn at the end of the class.
Me too. All right, thanks everybody. All right, let's move on here. We've got Anya up next.
Okay, so the Backyard Habitat Certification Program is a program that basically people enroll their own little yard and start working on making a more environmentally friendly yard. And I'll talk quite a bit more about that. I think it's actually next time. About how the program works, but basically what our program does is provides lots of resources for folks to help them in their journey in that respect. And so what you're seeing here is, if you imagine if your itty bitty little yard doesn't make any difference, this is what you're seeing when you put all those little itty bitty yards all together. So across the Portland region, the Backyard Habitat program is now in 4 counties. And so you can see all those enrolled yards, all the yards that are actually certified as well. That's color coded, although I realize that's really hard to see. But what you're seeing here is so 1,800 acres of habitat in the middle of the city and the suburbs in the Portland metro area. And more we're creating connected habitat or contiguous habitat. And that's the goal here. And then that's just the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. We also have other people who are making great efforts in their yards, or people who are enrolled in the National Wildlife Federation program, and obviously aren't represented in this image. So, all right, next slide, please. So historically, we've basically thought of our gardens as being pretty and a place for us to relax and maybe recreate, but they can be so much more. Susie mentioned earlier, 48 million acres of lawn in the US. That's about the size of the state of Michigan. And we really need to do better for habitat destruction and species decline in our region. So 40% of our region is in our backyards. And so in these areas, we have the power to do something about this, to help keep common birds common, for example. Our private yards can be important for the habitat that they provide, and for the ability to connect people to nature at home and in our neighborhoods, and to create an ethic of conservation and stewardship that will be even more important in the future. And urban gardeners have more understanding than ever before about their impacts and about the opportunities that they have. And that's what the Backyard Habitat Certification Program is here to do, is to help. Okay, next, please. So the Pacific Flyway is a very important migratory route for birds. It extends from Alaska to Patagonia and South America. And I'm sorry, are we doing the recording here? I was just gonna keep going.
Sorry, this part wasn't recording. I'll go ahead and play. I thought you could, yeah. Give me one. Are you ready?
Amy,
Okay.
I just want to make sure that you're sharing the sound on your end.
Yes.
Because
Can
it
you?
sounds earlier. Okay.
Is that
It just
better?
sounds muted.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and play this one for you all now. This is also Anya talking about the Pacific Flyway. And then let me know in the chat if you can't hear it, but I'm going to turn it up all the way.
So the Pacific Flyway is a really, really important migratory route for birds. It extends from Alaska on down to Patagonia in South America. Every year, migratory birds travel some or all of this distance, both in spring and fall. They're following food sources, heading to breeding grounds, or traveling to overwintering sites, all of which those things happen in our region. So we can't just pretend that this isn't or doesn't need to be better habitats. This wildlife habitat is in our developed communities, and we need to improve it. At least 209 out of the approximate 500 bird species found in Oregon use the Portland, Vancouver metropolitan region for some portion of their life cycle. But there are challenges. In the next slide, you'll see some of those challenges that are in our human-built environment that create obstacles for birds. Buildings, windows, and lights, yikes. More than 100 million birds die in window strikes every year, but there are lots of solutions. Silhouettes, decals, netting, moving feeders around the yard if you have feeders, maybe moving them farther or closer to the house. Those can be some solutions. Light pollution is also a problem. Most birds migrate at night, except for raptors. All the little tiny songbirds and even hummingbirds all migrate at night. Also, many moth species do migrate as well at night. And so lights can be really distracting and disorienting for birds. It can also affect predation and foraging and interfere with celestial cues that birds use for navigation. So birds can be a really big obstacle. Lights can be a really big obstacle for birds in migration. Also, health effects on people. So dark skies are really important for us too, interfering with our systems. And then we also just want to have dark skies. So that's important. So solutions: turning out unnecessary lights, using motion sensor lights for security, using fixtures that are shielded from above, and never using up lighting. So that's that really dramatic landscape lighting that we sometimes see. That's most important during migration times, but I encourage people to just get in the habit of turning out lights and making some of those changes. In the next slide, you will see some of those bird mortality issues that Susie and I both kind of hinted at. So 25% of our common bird species are in decline, as Sue said earlier, and these are some of the reasons why. These are all human-related environment issues that are affecting birds. So some of the highest numbers are affected from free-roaming cats and window strikes. Since COVID, I've talked to so many people who said to me, I never thought I had bird strikes on my windows, but now I'm home working and I'm, people are like in their homes in a different way, being quiet, working at their desk and hearing thuds on the glass. So those numbers are in the millions. So really, really high numbers. And those are things that we can do something about. Free-roaming cats and bird strikes on windows are something we can do something about. And the next slide, please. So other migration routes. So there are lots of other ways that different creatures use our environments besides just thinking about birds moving north to south. So different ways that different creatures might move around, whether it's riparian zones, wetland areas, even within our own yard spaces, much smaller creatures, insects, bees, lots of different ways that these environments get utilized by creatures that we don't necessarily look at very often or take notes of. So those can be even highway systems, roads, alleyways, waterways, and then also thinking about different altitudes or elevations. The next slide, we look at that. So here you're seeing, we look at 5 different canopy layers. So if you think about ground level, small shrub layer, large shrub layer, then understory trees, and then the big tree canopy that we see in the Northwest with like Doug firs and red cedars. So these are some of the birds that are associated with those different elevations. I think sometimes that we just kind of focus on what we see and we think that birds are all kind of at our level, but they aren't. They're utilizing different areas of the canopy and using it in different ways. So in the urban and suburban environment, we often kind of remove some of what we call the shrub layer. And I know Susie's going to talk about this more later, but that's a really important zone to fill back in. We often remove it because we want open sight lines, and that's important. Street corners and kids' play park areas and stuff like that, we need to be able to see. But in the home environment, it can be a really great way to fill in, create more privacy for us, and really, really important habitat. 60% of birds live in that shrub layer. And I do think Susan's going to talk about that some more later. So thank you, and next slide. So the Pacific.
Do we have any questions? I have a few that have come up. Is there a way to mitigate the crows on my property? Maybe it's just the natural balance, but they are getting the robin's eggs and the new babies, and it's so sad. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, that's really, really frustrating. Yeah, crows are big raucous birds, but like everybody else, they've got to eat, they've got to earn a living. Yeah, I've had jays take baby birds to feed their baby birds in my yard. But yeah, I know a lot of people these days are actually feeding crows. I'm not a big fan of that. I mean, at this point, I'm not really feeding any creatures. I'm just trying to provide habitat. The only thing I can say specifically about crows and deterring them is that the more lush habitat you have, I've seen a correlation with fewer crows with more lush habitat. They like more wide open spaces. And so I know for me in my yard, when I lost a tree on my south side, it kind of opened up my yard and I started having crows coming in for the first time. But obviously too, not providing any food sources for them. If they're using a bird bath, you might move that bird bath somewhere more sheltered and more cover nearby so that it's not as inviting to them.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question, and then we have some comments. So what works best to prevent window strikes? Do we have some suggestions?
Yeah, there's a lot of good resources. Portland Audubon has a good page for that, and Cornell Ornithology page also talks about that. Most people go for the decals, and the decals are either like a black silhouette of a bird, or there are also some that look clear to us but are ultraviolet colored. So birds see ultraviolet, but we see kind of a clear distortion. Those are probably the most common and the easiest. I've also just recently learned about ultraviolet markers, and you can actually just mark on your glass with the marker, make dashes or whatever you want. And again, you might just see a little bit of a smudge, but birds are going to see ultraviolet. Those are really common. What I was just talking about, those are all probably the most common because they're the easiest to apply. But there are some other kinds of netting or striping that you can put on the glass, or some people will, I've seen people put shades up on the outside. So a lot of times it's just kind of figuring out what seems to be the pattern in your yard. If it is related to bird feeders, that can be a situation where you move the feeder and try to find a better place for the feeder. Often with a feeder, it's either getting it farther away or sometimes actually really close to the glass. And that way the birds are more aware of the glass.
Great, thank you. We also have Jules, who had great success buying hawk decals from Audubon. Then we have some comments. So we have all about the night lighting. Tonight is apparently lights out, but Sunday or last Sunday was a red alert for bird migration in this area, and about 4 million birds moved through Oregon that night, which is pretty impressive. And we have a comment that lights also kill moths. So I think now we are probably ready to go on to who's next? Backyard habitat. And I guess it is, Christina Peterson, who could not be here this evening. So take it away, Amy, for Christina.
I am going to lead you all through elements of a wildlife habitat. So there are 4 elements that we want to focus on: food, water, cover and shelter, and places to raise young. So I'm going to go through each one of those categories, starting with food. So the most important food for our wildlife is through native plants. So these could be seeds, berries, nuts, foliage, pollen, nectar, all of the above. And our wildlife like a lot of variety. So some fun facts are that 75% of flowering plants require animal pollinators in order to successfully reproduce. Also, 20 to 30% of native bee species only collect pollen to provision young from certain plants. So native plants, very important for our wildlife. Next slide. Okay, and so one of the most important food for our birds are invertebrates. So 96% of terrestrial birds rely on invertebrates to feed their young. And birds, they like moth caterpillars, spiders, and crickets. So how can you attract more invertebrates to your yard? Planting native plants and reducing pesticides. Next slide. So here are a bunch of different food sources that you can put in your wildlife habitat. I mentioned the seeds, berries, nectar, pollen, and a lot of these are natural foods, but there are also supplemental foods that you can offer, which come from bird feeders, squirrel feeders, hummingbird feeders, and butterfly feeders. So again, variety, super important. Next slide. Okay, so our next category is water. All wildlife needs water to survive. Animals need it to drink, to bathe, or to even live in. So without water for birds to bathe in, their feathers will become dirty and heavy, and flight will be very difficult for them. And water can also provide cover for wildlife, reproduction space, and also places to raise young, and I'll get into that later. Next slide. slide. So here are a couple examples of wildlife using water in their native habitat: frogs, owls, birds, insects, lots of different wildlife. Next slide. So something important to consider with water are puddling areas. You might have areas in your backyard that look muddy, and you might try and cover that up because it doesn't look appealing, or maybe you just don't think that it's beneficial. But these puddling areas are actually very beneficial to different wildlife. So butterflies actually engage in a behavior called puddling, where they will find these wet and muddy areas and they will gather up that mud, and then they will use the nutrients in that mud to survive. So you might have these natural puddling areas, but you can also create your own. And you can do that by taking a shallow dish and you'll fill it with sand, compost, and water, and you can place that in a sunny area, and that will help attract bees, birds, butterflies, moths, all of those different species. Next slide. So with water, we can also consider beyond our property. So water doesn't technically need to be right in your backyard to help make your wildlife property successful. So these are two examples. On the left is a creek near Camp Tamarack in Sisters, Oregon. And on the right is Wade Creek Pond at the Etiquette Library. So both of these areas provide a lot of water and beneficial habitat for wildlife. Next slide. So again, here are a bunch of different options for how you can provide different water sources. Again, you might have natural water sources or man-made. Those bird baths, using the shallow dish, a rain garden. And something to consider is that wildlife needs, again, a variety of different water sources. So having those tall bird baths and then a dish on the ground could help provide for the different height differences in wildlife. You also want to make sure that your water is clean, and especially if it snows or it gets icy, that you're making sure that you still have water in your yard and it's not all frozen water. Okay, next slide. So our next section is cover and shelter. So wildlife needs this shelter to get away from extreme temperatures like hot and cold, high windstorms, and other weather conditions. So these cover and shelter areas are also great for escaping from predators. Next slide. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can offer cover and shelter. Again, natural and man-made. These are two examples of some man-made covers and shelters. On the left is a large bird nest habitat that was made of a kiddie pool. And this is supposed to mimic a bird nest. And then on the right, you have an insect hotel that was built at the Oregon Zoo for their wildlife garden, which is actually a certified wildlife habitat. So these are two projects. You could do at your home, or you could make something smaller to have something supplemental. Next slide. And here are again a lot of options for natural and man-made. You have wooded areas, standing trees. Something that I will say is that we tend to want to make our yards look pretty, and we would want to rake up those leaves or gather up branches that have fallen and make sure that everything looks more clean. And these leaves and twigs and plants that are on the ground actually provide a great source of cover and shelter for our wildlife. So we want to leave our leaves, leave our sticks, leave our logs, and try not to burn anything. Also, you can help make your ground cover less bare by adding plants that could cover that area or restoring grassland. So there are a lot of different options. Again, there are supplemental options like roosting boxes or nesting boxes or bat houses. So a lot of different ways for cover and shelter. Okay, next slide. Okay, our last category, places to raise young. So all wildlife needs a place to raise their young, and they raise young in all different levels of your backyard, high in trees, low on the ground, all over. So it's especially important to provide these places, spaces and resources for wildlife to mate, engage in courtship behavior, and to be able to gather materials to create their nests or whatever shelter they want to create. Next slide. So one example of something that is not natural is a nesting box. So these nesting boxes or bird houses, a lot of people have them in their backyard. They're great. Birds do not live in them, but they do use them to help raise their young, transition between seasons. And these bird boxes should mimic the natural cavities in trees. So you might have trees already in your yard that wildlife are using to raise their young, and that's fantastic. If you don't, you might want to consider adding a nesting box. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we also need to consider juvenile versus adult needs. So all wildlife have different habitat needs, different needs for places to raise young. And so this is a great time to talk about juvenile versus adult. So again, we want to provide a lot of different habitats for our wildlife. For example, caterpillars of butterflies and moths only feed on certain host plants. So we want to make sure that we are providing those host plants to attract those specific juveniles. Monarch butterflies the caterpillars also feed on milkweed. So milkweed is a great example of a native plant that you can put in your yard. And then one little fact is that over 90% of native insects cannot complete their life cycles without native plants. So take a minute to think about that. 90%. That shows us how important it is to provide these specific habitat requirements. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, here is a list for a bunch of different options for places to raise young. Like I said, leaving the leaves, leaving the sticks. Variety is great. Meadows, prairies, and then you can see on the right here some man-made options like this chickadee bird house up here that is in Morgan's yard. Next slide. Okay, and we want to remember all of our different seasons. We need to be providing native plants and constructing a habitat that is great in all seasons. So in these pictures, you can see winter, spring, and fall, and spring/summer. And so you can see that these are actually from Morgan's yard as well. She likes to leave the leaves in stalks of plants. She just lets everything grow on its own. And this provides a great wildlife habitat. And so when thinking about seasonal plants, some examples of what you can plant is snowberry in the spring and the winter, and then milkweed in the summer and fall. Next slide. Okay, and where would we be without gardening for salmon? Being that I am part of the steelheaders, it's important that we talk about how gardening affects our salmon and their habitats. So fertilizers and pesticides can be very harmful for salmon. If we are using toxic chemicals in our gardens, those can get washed away in the rain and end up in our river systems. We want to also be providing great riparian areas for our salmon, keeping water shady and cool, keeping them clean, providing food and habitat for insects. Again, if you provide native plants in your wildlife habitat, then insects will come, they will eat those native plants, and then you are able to then support the salmon because then the salmon will eat those insects. And like we like to say, sustainable gardens equals healthy water, which equals healthy fish.
Okay, well, our chat has gone berserk. So, oh, is she stopping? I'm going to start again. Okay, now we're going to have questions. We have lots of questions and we have lots of answers here. So first we want to talk about the bird migration at night. If you're interested in seeing it in action, check the chat up a little high. It's from Susie. She said that if you want to see the bird migration in action in your area, check out Cornell University's Birdcast, and she put the link in there. Then we talked a little bit about light pollution. Anya was telling us she's just learned that light pollution is a huge problem for lightning bugs. Not here in Portland, but there's many species of lightning bugs around the world. We talked about the sound of running water can be a great bird attractant. So don't assume that birds don't need water in the winter, birds and critters, because that's something that everybody needs. And there we have another person kind of join us. We have a question about avian flu. Is it here yet? And do these water sources spread it? Do you have any answers? Somebody needs to unmute.
Yeah, I don't, on my end, I don't have any answers for avian flu. It may be something that folks can check with the Oregon Department of Agriculture about, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife may have information on avian flu as well.
Yeah, and since a lot of times people will ask me about avian flu, and what they're actually talking about is the salmonella that affects a lot of birds that visit feeders. And that it was in the news a lot last year, like over a year ago. It was a really big problem last year here in the Portland area. And so usually the discussion is a lot around feeders and how a lot of feeder activity means that a lot of finches are congregating in a way that wouldn't be normal and out in the wild. And so they're just like us. We don't want them to mix too much too close. And so it's definitely still an issue with water sources. It's important to keep the water source, clean, and to flush out your fountains or bird baths and give them a scrub every once in a while. Usually, and depending on what kind of surfaces that you have, that can be really, really easy or not so easy. And so I encourage you to think about some of the cleaning when you choose something that fits into your habitat or that you like the aesthetic look of. So like, for example, concrete, you might need to really scrub at it. If it's glass or a smooth finish, it can be really super easy to just swish out really easily.
Great. And I'm sorry.
I like to use small tube feeders, actually small enough it can run them through my dishwasher about once a week. It works really nicely. And then also keep them in some place where they're not going to get too much rain on them helps keep a lot of the bacteria issues down as well. So if you can find an overhang or even just put a canopy or something over them, that makes a big difference.
Great. And Betsy's just shared with us that Portland Audubon has put out a statement about avian flu today. So you may want to check with the Portland Audubon website. We had a question about resources available. Oh,
both Audubon and Juvenile Lab always have really good info on all of that.
Great, thank you. We had a question if there were resources for folks who don't own property but live in an apartment for native species in pots. Is that a possibility, ladies and gentlemen? Eric and the rest of you?
Yeah, definitely. I typed in a reply in the chat, but yeah, I've seen people grow native plants in pots. I myself did a whole series of pots with wildflowers so that there's a progression of wildflowers blooming through the season. Yeah, you can definitely do that. And then obviously to a bird bath or something too on a patio.
Wonderful. We have lots to talk about rats. Rats are not some people like. So if you, I'm sorry, somebody have something else to say?
Oh, it's Nicole.
Yeah. Or go ahead, Nicole.
I just wanted to add on the rats because there's a lot of discussion there that fruiting trees, if you have any kind of tree with a fruit, you really have to be careful about getting those fruits up and eating them or using them. and thinking about maybe taking advantage of gleaners programs where you can donate fruit, because rats will just love that.
Very true. Very true. Okay, Eric, you had something to say.
It's just another great thing for it. If you just have a patio or something, is a mason bee box is a really easy thing to do.
That's true, and that's great habitat for everyone else who's got flowers and fruit. Okay, so we have rats. We are going to clean up our fruit from our fruit trees. Some people have stopped using their bird feeders and just offer water and habitat, which is always a good idea. We also had a question about, do we need, if we have nesting boxes, do we need to clean them out each year, or do we leave them alone?
Yeah, I responded to that. It's important to clean them out, get those cleaned and sanitized with boiling water and let them dry.
Wonderful. Okay, now we have a question here about earwigs. Oh, where's that earwig question? I'm sorry, I will go on to the next one, and while we're answering it, I'll go find the earwig question. Is salt for weeds considered toxic? Anybody?
I think that we have to be careful using any kind of salts on
And
wheat.
I reply to that in the chat.
Okay. Do you, Anya, do you want to go ahead? Yeah, talk about the soil.
Yeah, so I've known people who, I knew somebody once who got really fed up about the neighbor's bamboo and was poisoning it with salt. So salt, when we talk about salt, like table salt, sodium, that can really build up in the soil and be really long lasting and bad for lots of plants. And it can create almost like a wasteland. And that's different from, sometimes I talk to people about creating these homemade weed sprays with Epsom salts and dish soap, and Epsom salts is chemically a completely different thing. So there's sodium salt, and then there's like Epsom salt. So make sure you know what you're talking about. But sodium is definitely something I would avoid adding to soil.
Okay, and then we have one here question. I noticed last summer that I had more than usual earwigs in my plants, with many of them dying prematurely. What can I do? Earwigs? We have nothing from our panel of experts here.
I would recommend Master Gardener on that one. I don't have an answer, but the Master Gardeners might have some ideas there.
Okay, so Cooperative Extension Master Gardeners, and they usually have phone line open during the week, so give them a call. Also, her backyard gets raccoons, skunks, gophers too a lot, so she has a lot of wildlife. That's good, but the skunks sometimes leave a nasty after smell. We have 3 new messages down here. Okay, I have a neighbor that feeds squirrels peanuts. The squirrels are constantly digging up my garden and new plants. Any ideas to deter those little rascals?
You know, squirrels sometimes can be deterred with just essential oils like peppermint oils. I was having this conversation with someone today about any kind of rodent can be deterred with certain, lavender or peppermint oils. Also, if you have rodents such as squirrels, rats, or mice that are getting into enclosed areas, you can use, believe it or not, just park a cube of Irish Springs soap in the vicinity, and that is a deterrent as well. Some people use dryer sheets in the area, stake to sticks. There are a million ways that you can just make the place uninhabitable to them, but the reality is you're going to have them in your yard. You may just not have as many.
Cool. How do we combat wasps in addition to eliminating standing water?
I was going to offer something for that. This is something that I read about, and I haven't tried it, but I read about it on a natural solutions to these kinds of problems. And it was to, in the night when the wasps are, like if you have a wasp nest, and I have had wasp nests in my yard, down in the soil, and to actually go out in the night and put a little pile of peanut butter or spread some peanut butter on something near the nest, like really close, because that can be a real attractant to raccoons, and raccoons will eat the wasps if they find the nest. So that might be a great natural solution, feeding another critter, a critter you don't want. But I know it can be a challenge. I've had wasps in my yard and I've mostly put up with them. But I also know some people will actually put out, a pest person, family member of a pest professional told me this once. You can put out the wasp traps early in the season, like now, to catch the queens, to eliminate the whole nest later in the season.
That's good advice.
They also sell these fake paper wasp nests that are actually quite effective, because different species of wasps are very territorial. And so if wasps you don't like yellow jackets, see that there's already some other kind of wasp that has a presence in the area, they'll just stay out of the way.
Oh, well, that's pretty cool too. We also have one question. Is it recommended to add Epsom salts to bird baths?
I don't know why you do that. I would just offer fresh, clean water.
Great. I think that we have covered all the questions. If not, please let us know and we will pick them up. But I believe, does that bring us to our break, Amy?
Yes, it does. Our first break, and well timed because we are exactly 1 hour in. So if you'd like, everyone, we can take just a couple minutes to refill whatever beverage you have and use the restroom, and then we'll come back in about 4 to 5 minutes, something like that. But if you do want to stick around, I do have a couple polls for you just for fun while we're all here. So I'll go ahead and get our first one ready for you just for fun. Actually, this is a poll that I was going to share with you during the intro, but I forgot. So I'm going to share it with you now. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's just for fun. You all see it okay?
I can see it.
There's a lot to read there. Who comes up with these holidays? Some of them are really funny. We'll give you all a couple more minutes. We still got some answers trickling in here. All right, we're holding pretty steady here at 75%. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results with you all. It looks like most folks thought that it is National Administrative Professionals Day, or maybe National Gummy Bear Day. Some all of the above. This was Morgan's idea. Morgan, can you let us know what holiday it is today?
All of the above. Gummy bear. No food waste. Minute Day. Tell a story. Devil Dog Day. Plus more that we didn't even add. It's also Prime Rib Day.
I don't actually know what a devil dog is. What's that, Anya?
Oh, I said every day's Devil Dog Day at my house.
All right, that was fun. I have a couple more here while we're hanging out. I've got this one. This is back to our topic. Got a good range of responses on this one so far.
I was also going to say, if anybody figures out the peanut problem, I would love to know the answer, because in my yard, they're getting somebody's feeding peanuts nearby, and the squirrels like to come and bury the nuts in my yard, and then my dog digs trenches to try to find the peanuts because he can smell them. So I have a series of trenches and holes, and let me tell you, this dog can seriously dig a trench.
No wonder every day is National Devil Dog Day for you.
And that's the noisy one.
I suspect
Maybe-
he's finding a lot of J caches too.
Maybe your dog can dig up Aram then on the way.
We've talked about loaning him out to like a plumber or something, because he could dig trenches. He's very surgical in his abilities.
Nice.
Someone is feeding the squirrels in my area bread, because I'll find bread in my flower pot sometimes that they have buried in there.
Oh, and I heard
Yikes.
recently
Yeah.
on Next Door, people were talking about baby crows getting fed chunks of bread and choking
Oh,
because they don't know to take little bites, and they're like these big crusty chunks that people are dumping. So don't feed. I don't recommend feeding wildlife.
Agreed. And bread is such a bad actor. There's no nutrition in it for wildlife. It expands in their stomach. It clogs their crops and impedes the grit process. So it's really just such a deadly thing. And I see this so often with people feeding waterfowl at ponds. They bring loaves of Wonder Bread out and whatnot. And there was actually a study in New England done about 15 years ago that they had animals that were starved to death, waterfowl, and they had been fed bread. They were not fat-free, they weren't skinny, but they certainly received so little nutrition that they were nutritionally deprived and died. So not doing any favors.
yeah.
I also have a neighbor who, an elderly neighbor whose crows kept bringing stale bread and soaking it in her bird bath. And so her backyard smelled like a brewery from the yeast. And it was a
Oh,
concrete bird bath. And she was really elderly. And so she couldn't get out there and keep it clean enough. So it was really gross.
Oh, man. Well, we do have our results from our second poll here, and it looks like most of you are close. Susie, this is something that you talked about. Do you want to elaborate?
Sure. Our insects, our local insects have co-evolved with our local vegetation here, so that every aspect of our vegetation on, locally is utilized by our insects or our wildlife. So non-native plants have not co-evolved with our wildlife here. So very little of those, again, 2 to 5% of that plant can be utilized by our native critters versus 98% with our native wildlife, our native plants. So really important take home next time you're buying that boxwood at the Home Depot to think, is this local? Is this native? And really, is it a Willamette Valley native? Is it native to our region right here, not just Oregon?
Yeah. Okay, I think I have two more if we have time. We're getting pretty close now, so we'll go ahead and do one more quick one.
Isn't that the same one that we just?
No.
Oh no, that's native.
Because yeah, it's kind of a trick here. You have to read carefully. give everyone just about 30 more seconds here. We're about 70%, 75.
Well, while we're waiting, Erin has suggested to us that she used to have squirrels plant nuts in her pots, but now she's planted lavender and they don't do that anymore. So there, squirrels, take that lavender.
Okay, so here's our results from this poll. It looks like everyone's catching on.
Good job.
Yep. All right. Okay, if we're all back now, let's go ahead and move into our next, our second half of the session. See what we've got for you. We have a recording from Anya, so I'll go ahead and play that for you, and I will turn the volume up as high as possible. You guys are doing a great job with your questions in the chat, so please keep it up.
So native plants. So we've talked about some of this a little bit already, but basically native plant communities and insects have evolved over 4.6 billion years. So those insects are largely specialist insects. So when we think about a lot of non-native bugs, when they move to different areas, different territories, different continents, they're often generalists, meaning that they'll eat just about anything or from a wide variety of plants. But our native insects are specialists. They rely on very specific species of plants for their life cycle. And so that co-evolution between native plants and native insects is a really important relationship, because then those insects are basically the food web building blocks for the whole habitat, for the whole ecosystem. And so without those native plants, we don't have those native insects that are the food for those common birds that we talked about being in decline. So that's a really important relationship to support and nurture and reinstate in some cases. So what are we talking about when we're talking about native plants? So if you ask a random selection of people, different people are going to have a different definition of native plants. For purposes of the Backyard Habitat Certification Program that I work for, we use the Portland Plant List as our guide to what's considered locally native. So when you go to a nursery, you might go to the native plant section, and nurseries are in the business of selling plants, and so they don't want to be too restrictive. So they may be offering you plants from Oregon, they may be offering you plants from the Pacific Northwest, or it could even be the West or the US. So it's important to ask that question, what do you mean by native, if you're at a nursery, or if you're getting some advice from someone, or if you're hiring a professional to do work in your yard. I recently looked at a landscape plan from a homeowner that thought that they had all native plants in their front yard that was just redone, and it was a whole bunch of regionally native plants. So that isn't a bad thing, but they weren't necessarily speaking the same language. So asking, what do you mean by native, native to where, that's really useful knowledge for you to have. The Portland Plant List is a wonderful resource guide. Besides just lists of native plants, there's a lot more information in there, so I encourage you to check it out. Those are going to be plants that evolved in the lower Willamette Valley, roughly 50 miles around the Portland area. And so that's what we consider or call locally native. And then cultivars. So cultivars are a tricky thing. The nursery trade cultivates plants for specific features. Sometimes the changes that might be created from those plants are relatively minor. So it could be some plant that's created or altered for better disease resistance, or there's a lot of different reasons. It could be a showier flower, it could be a different colored flower, it could be a different colored foliage, it could be just more drought tolerance, or it could be slightly smaller size for fitting into our urban and suburban garden better. There's so many different reasons that plants get altered by the nursery trade. And so because of that, at least for purposes of the Backyard Habitat Certification Program, we consider cultivars as ornamentals. because we can't do research on all those different cultivars. But I think it's important for you to look for that when you go to a nursery, when you look at a plant, look at the tag and see if there's kind of a cute name in single quotation marks on the tag. So those are going to be some common things that you'll see at the native plant section at a nursery. It could be a red flowering currant. There's one called, I think it's Henry the Seventh or King Edward the Seventh. There are Pacific ninebarks that have radically different looking foliage colors. There's a red Diablo foliage. There's a brown chocolate foliage. Black lace elderberry is a classic example of one that is really radically changed. The leaf color is changed, the leaf shape is changed. The key thing really is if the bloom is affected in some way, if the bloom has been changed or affected in some way in that cultivation, that's going to be the most disruptive thing probably for the insects that rely on native plants, whether or not they're going to recognize that as a native plant. So that's an important thing to know about cultivars. And then in terms of biodiversity and ornamentals, so we've already talked a little bit about this. We've sort of dissed a little bit already on ornamental plants. Most common ornamental plants come from a really narrow set of family groups. Think about a lot of those spring blooming flowering trees, fruit trees like ornamental cherry and ornamental plum and ornamental, all of those kind of prunus species. A lot of spring blooming shrubs and small trees. Ornamental plants are selected by the nursery trade because they're easy to propagate. Many of these are sterile and they're spread through human assistance or interference. And so, we don't want messy street trees. We don't want some of that fruit. So those things have been altered to eliminate some of that, what we call quote unquote mess. So they're sterile then. And this leads to a loss of genetic information that helps these species evolve and adapt over time. And so there can be unforeseen consequences. So really important to consider all of those things when we're looking at selection of choosing ornamental plants or choosing native plants. So then noxious weed species. So we sometimes say invasive plants. I like to call them noxious weed species or noxious weeds. And these are not your common garden weeds. These are not dandelions. These are not the bittercress that's popping up right now. These are ecosystem disruptors. These plants outcompete natives. They find a niche in the habitat, in the environment that they're able to exploit in some way. So maybe it's that they're really good at seed dispersal or germination or colonization. A lot of us are seeing right now lesser celandine out there. It comes up really, really early. It takes advantage of this time. Pollinators are out. They're looking for flowers. There aren't a lot out there right now. And so they've got pretty focused attention from a lot of pollinators. They're really good at seed dispersal. And so they really exploit that niche in the habitat. So some of these plants are able to be successful because they have vegetative growth. So that means, like in the case of pokeweed or knotweed, you can chop the plant up, you can yank it off, yank the stem off, throw it on the ground, and it could resprout. So the pieces or the chunks of it or the root system, any and all of that could resprout without being assisted or supported. So that's why a lot of these noxious weed species, it's recommended to remove them and put them in plastic in the trash and not in yard waste bins for composting. And some of these plants are allelopathic, which means that they are able to alter the soil in some way. Ivy, for example, English ivy secretes a compound into the soil that is sort of like a anti-growth hormone. It dampens the ability of other seeds to germinate. And so in that way, it's able to really overwhelm the local habitat. It creates a monoculture of itself. Obviously, this all leads to decreasing biodiversity. and even, changes to soil, habitat, sun, shade, lots of ways in which they're interfering, and taking the place of native species. And again, interfering with that really important native plant and insect relationship that interrupts the whole food web. So these, like I said, noxious weed species are not common garden weeds. These are really powerful plants.
Okay, so do we have any questions for Anya? I have one here. We want to find out if there is a way to obtain free or low-cost native plants. I know that you did put something in the chat, but maybe people that didn't or paying attention to you talking didn't catch that. Can you go over that with us?
Yep. So if you live in the city of Portland, Urban Forestry has been giving away yard trees the last couple of seasons. I don't know if they'll do it again, but that's been a great way to get free trees. And they have been giving away some really great ones. I've seen some really great ponderosa pines, Oregon white oaks. So that's been a great source for some really good trees. Also, the Friends of Backyard Habitat Facebook page, which is kind of a mouthful, is a great source for all kinds of information. But a lot of times I've seen people giving away or trading plants on there. I've traded plants on there. And so a lot of times people will even just be playing around with trying to see if they can germinate from seed, and then they have a whole flat of something that they only need one or two of, and they're just giving away all the extras. So that's a great way to get free stuff.
Great, and I know that there's many soil and water conservation districts in the area that will have native plant sales, and those are usually smaller plants, but usually fairly decent prices. We did have people talking about trading plants, and Eric wanted to share with us that make sure not to share plants from the Japanese beetle quarantine area in Cedar Mills. So be really careful when you're sharing plants, and don't share those invasive weeds. Know what it is that you are sharing.
Definitely.
What
I
else?
wanted to mention a very inexpensive native plant nursery for those of us that live in the Sandy Estacada area. Echo Valley Natives just moved up here from Oregon City, and they have very reasonable plants and a beautiful nursery, again, up here in Sandy.
Okay, and Sherry wanted to also to mention this, don't get that celandine and share that with other people, because that stuff is really hard to get rid of once you get it, and she sees it all over the place.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Anya.
Oh, I was just gonna say the lesser celandine was so pretty this year in particular because it was we had a dry period, and yeah, the worst thing about it is that it's so darn pretty that people want it. And I've definitely known people to get it because they dug it up and transplanted it into their yard. So yeah, be careful. Make sure you know what you're getting.
They are sad from that day on. Okay, do we have any other questions? I guess not. So next we're going to have Susie live, and she's going to talk about inspiration habitats.
All right. So now that we understand many of the issues that we have at hand and habitat requirements, let's talk about making your yard fabulous and ecologically healthy. So I love this quote here. I like this place and I could willingly waste time in it. That's my edict for all of my native planting on my farm. It is, you want to have a place that you can find peace and sanctuary. So think of one of your favorite places in Western Oregon. And then in the chat box, who can name a few for me? So go ahead and throw that in the chat box, some of your favorite places in Western Oregon. Yachats, beautiful. I was just there. Camassia, fabulous, also beautiful, and it must be in full bloom right around now. Pacific City, Mount Hood National Forest, mine too. Wasabi Island, Silver Falls, Mosier, Clackamas River, all kinds of really amazing places. Yeah, so we've got some really beautiful places, and I think that, and I love the Mount Hood National Forest. That's one of my favorite places. It's also in my neck of the woods. And Lolo Pass Road in particular, because I love to gather what I call soon-to-be-dead roadside plants up there in the late fall that are in the plow zone. So I think about these places that I could willingly waste time in. And when we start to think about these places that are our favorite places, in particular that are kind of in similar areas as the, you know, up northern Willamette Valley or similar climates to where we live, we want to start to think about how we can shrink our favorite places into our healthy yards or acreage at home. So go ahead and switch to the next slide. So here's an example. This is an 85-acre conserved property that belongs to the Columbia Land Trust. It's right outside of the Dalles, Oregon. It's the Four Sisters property. And on it is a vernal pool. And we have spots like this right in the Willamette Valley as well as in the Clackamas Basin. And again, because the camas is starting to blow right now, it is so amazing to see these wet meadows. And I just gave away the flowers. So again, these are camas flowers. It also includes some native bunch grasses in here. So again, Four Sisters. Let's go ahead and next slide, please. And then I want to introduce you here to this fabulous man here, Tim Miller. Tim Miller loves Four Sisters property. He also lives on a major thoroughfare right in Portland. So he loves to go into these natural areas and he takes his inspiration from them right into his garden. The far right on Tim's property there is a vernal pool with those same plant communities that Tim built. I absolutely love Tim Miller. Next slide. So Tim went ahead and created a camas meadow in his yard. It's a beautiful wetland and it's all right down to that large wood snag in the middle of it. Tim's plants in this photo include monkey flower, common camas, native asters, and sword fern. Go ahead and next slide. I'm going to give you another inspirational property. This is the front yard of my dear friend Galen's place in Portland. She has a sunny yard, can get pretty blazing hot, and she has a love of flowering plants, and she loves to bring pollinators to her yard. She gets all of that with her low maintenance meadow. So, oh, and she gets a lot of kudos from the neighbors too. She used to have a terrible lawn on the yard and what do you call a hell strip, which is now another pollinator meadow. So I wish I had a photo of her hell strip, but she made a whole different pollinator space that's a little bit geared towards drier species of pollinator plants. By the way, this barren, awful piece of lawn or weeds or nothingness that lies between sidewalks and streets is, we shouldn't overlook this thing or any of these kind of little barren spots in our yard because they can become incredible microhabitats. So some of the plants that she has here in this photo are Ceanothus, Oregon iris, camas, a bunch of native bunch grasses, red flowering currant. I'm sure there are quite a few more plants in there that I'm not IDing. So let me go to this third inspiration. This is Marie Pierre. She's a transplant from northern France. So she carries a lot of things from northern France in her heart. She's standing in front of her new home there in the West Hills when she bought it, and a map of invasive ivy. Her place is right up against Forest Park, which was pretty grand, but the monoculture of invasives that she inherited when she purchased the place was pretty devastating. So Marie Pierre worked very hard to get the invasives removed over a couple of years and find the forest understory that she knew could be there again. She even found this amazing stump from a tree logged more than 100 years ago. So you can even see in this native stump springboard cuts in the bottom portion of it. So here, I also want to mention that when we talk about naturescaping, we're not saying rip out all the non-native things and stick in only native things. We're really talking about adding native things. So we all have our pet plants that we love. So does Marie Pierre. Maybe they're roses or lilacs, or in Marie Pierre's case, tulips. Tulip's reminder of her home in France, and they're also wonderfully integrated into her native plant garden. Or maybe her garden is wonderfully integrated into her tulips. You can take your pick. In slide 27, you can see once the monoculture of ivy was removed and the natives were put in, the wildlife came, and how did it? Marie Collier's yard is not only an attractant to pollinators, abundant songbirds, woodpeckers, hawks, and even these big sheep, did I just say sheep? These big guys, these big deer. We may also find that some of our wildlife really enjoys our native plants and the key habitat it creates as well. This is where sharing the magic happens. The deer or native brush rabbits may enjoy dining on some of your buffet. I just planned a little bit more of the buffet and enjoy sharing it. If sharing is not your thing, there may be native plants that you can also put in there that deer are a little bit less interested in, so browser resistant. Either way, you're going to find your inspiration, find which plants work well within your yard's constraints, and you just go with it. And so next we're going to have a video from Anya, and she's going to be talking about rain gardens.
But first, do we have any questions for Susie about inspiration habitat? I think a couple came through in the chat.
We have a lot of people that liked the pictures that Susie put up, so that was great.
I love this photo. Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
All right, I think Anya, it's all yours.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to play this. Let me know if it's too quiet.
Rain gardens. So rain gardens are a really fun way, fun, creative, interesting, and effective way to deal with stormwater in our yards. So I have a couple different slides here with photos, and I just want to help you wrap your head around the idea of a rain garden or a bioswale, which is basically the same thing. We usually refer to commercial sort of rain gardens as bioswales. So the street bioswales that we see around our cities, and then rain gardens in our yard. But these are planted areas that are capturing stormwater runoff. Maybe it's water that's redirected from downspouts. Maybe it's just a low-lying area in your yard. I've been to yards that have springs or seasonally flowing creeks. So there's lots of different things that we deal with in our yards. And so this is water that we're trying to help process on site. We want to help that water to percolate and infiltrate deeper into the soil rather than running off with stormwater into stormwater drains and then eventually into creeks and rivers where it takes contaminants. And we also have these kind of increasingly intense weather events. So sometimes we have these kind of flash flood situations where we have erosion. So we want to reduce all of those negatives and try to capture that water on site. Lawn can also be pretty poor at helping water to percolate and infiltrate into the soil. So if you've been out in a squishy, swampy winter lawn, part of the reason is that grass is holding the water on the surface. The roots are really shallow. So as opposed to the plants that we would choose to put in a rain garden. And so rain garden plants are basically plants that in nature are going to be in floodplain areas. They're plants that are in seasonally wet meadows or creek sides or places like that. And we've kind of adapted them into this construct that we call a rain garden. And so they're plants that like wet feet in the winter, but are still adapted to our summer drought conditions because that is just our normal summer here. And so these plants help the water to percolate and infiltrate into the soil. So I have seen many, many very creative ways to do this. So sometimes it's really straightforward. You have a downspout, you have a pool, you put plants in. But sometimes, as you see here, there are some different kind of creek bed features, or sometimes we have different ways that we need to help that water to move away from our house, to move away from pavement. And so in the next slide, you'll see some other views of this. So I really like this illustration because it shows you both a side view where you get to see at the left, the downspout or wherever that water is coming from, it's being intentionally piped into this rain garden. And then you see it flowing into this depression or pool, whatever it might be. And then that water is being helped to infiltrate into the soil through the different reeds and sedges and different plants that have been planted there. And then also, further along, there are some bigger plants, some trees and other shrubs and things that are helping to process that water. In the overview, you see with those lines, you're able to kind of see some of the wetter and drier zones of the rain garden. So the deeper part is going to be wetter, obviously more wet, more often. And those are the plants that are more adapted to really wet feet and really liking those wet conditions. And then as you go up the sides, you have less wet areas. And then there may also even be an overflow where if it fills up, there is still an intended place for excess water to go. Because sometimes that happens, or just in case. Or I've been to homes where they didn't know they needed an overflow until they needed an overflow. And then in the photo on the left, you see maybe a just dug, just installed, just planted rain garden where the plants are very small. And then in the next slide, you can see some other approaches to rain gardens. So here you see some more lush plantings. It's filled in a little bit more than that last slide. In the bottom left, you also see where they've actually had to direct water through a patio or a pathway. And they've actually broken the concrete area and have a flow through that area. So sometimes, especially in the more urban, suburban environment, it can be kind of tricky. There's a lot of pavement, there are pathways, there's driveways, there's, your house, but then right outside of your house, then there's the neighbor's house, there's just a lot more density. And you run into some of these challenges with pavement and different obstacles. Lots of different creative ways to do this. And it's a fun way to play with the different palette of plants that we don't always get to play with in the more urban and suburban environments. And as we know that our region was traditionally had a lot of, I shouldn't say traditionally, historically, it had a lot of wetlands, a lot of water. And so a lot of these plants have really been reduced in our region. So this can be a way to add some of those back in.
Okay, so thank you, Anya. Did you want to talk to us a little bit about the Oregon Rain Garden Guide?
Sure, it's just the best source. If you just like Google rain gardens, you're going to see a lot of different things that are designed for different parts of the country, different places. And I feel like the Oregon Rain Garden Guide is really should be the source that you look at because it is designed for our very wet winter here. And people can kind of play around with the rain garden as a feature in other areas that aren't nearly as wet as ours and don't have to be functionally so effective. So it is important to evaluate your site. And the Rain Garden Guide does talk about testing your soil for percolation, how to evaluate your site, how to evaluate potentially how much water is coming off of your roof, or at least that portion of the roof. And then how to install a rain garden, imagining what that might look like. And then it does include plant information as well. So there's a lot of information packed into that, and it's a great guide. But it is really important. A lot of times I go to sites and I see people disconnecting downspouts and having that water flow in the yard in some way. And it's really important to plan for that before you disconnect, if you haven't already disconnected. And then to, a lot of times it's really easy to disconnect most or many of your downspouts, but there's that one that's at the corner of the house where there's a pavement sidewalk and there's a driveway and maybe the house and the garage. And, there's all this hardscape. And so that can be the one place that you're like, okay, in a couple of years, I'm going to redo that driveway, or I'm going to redo that hardscaping, And that can be a way to integrate it into a future project. And so I like to put the bug in your ear to think about that for a future project, but sometimes it can really take some real planning to figure out how that might work on your site.
Great, thank you. And I believe Jules is going to take your advice and get that guide. Looks like Nicole put the link to it in the chat. So
Thank
happy
you.
rain gardening. I believe Susie, we're going to have a recording of Susie and Hedgerows.
So moving on to hedgerows. So this ain't it. Not at all. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So sometimes you really just want to screen something. So we may want to screen the neighbor, the street, the ugly chain link fence, whatever. So did you know actually that in our rural areas in particular, these in the last slide, those fast moving, we grow this kind of big ugly laurel everywhere. And I just want to bring people's attention to the fact that every single part of that plant is toxic. Stems, leaves, berries, you name it. It contains hydrocyanic toxins that can kill animals and humans if any part is ingested. So we still stick these things everywhere, including in rural areas as screens. They're quite invasive as well. So what if we could change that policy for this gorgeous thing right here and flip the idea of keeping our privacy on its ear a little bit. So this is a beautiful, functional, excess water drinking, ugly view blocking native hedgerow. So what makes it so special? Well, first, I may be very biased, but I think it's beautiful. It's been planted with shrubs and forbs, and it will produce flowers throughout the growing season. So voila, you have color all the time in the growing season. It means that different pollinators and different birds will be arriving and sticking around all of the time. So we'll have hummingbirds to bees to butterflies to moths, you name it. Second, it's really important for a nesting songbird. So as we mentioned before, 60% of our regional species nest in the shrub layer. So this native hedgerow is an excellent habitat for a lot of birds during the nesting season. If you remember too, that most of those babies eat what? That's right, insects. There are a lot of insects that can live on these hedgerows as well. So it's quite a beautiful little system. They provide ample food for other birds as well in the form of seeds and nectars. And we can even plant these native hedgerows that provide nibbling for us as well. So salal, crabapple, salmonberry, pearly, everlasting, Oregon grape, all kinds of things that we can nibble on too, which is really fun. So it's not just always about the wildlife. And then third, these things grow fast. And because our native plants know how to drown in the winter and starve in the summer, they require no extra watering and they're naturally pest resistant. So this is a big deal. They're great site barriers. They have varied root depths as well. So as you can see, some of these smaller shrubs have their roots go shallow, the bigger ones, the roots go deeper, and that means that they're really pulling up a lot of that water column running through your soil. So it's kind of win, win, and win. And then lastly, I want to mention that if we use this as a fence, critters can move through these quite easily on their corridors as opposed to fences and other solid barriers. So don't forget about your wildlife couriers and your little guys that have to scoot along the ground. So this particular yard, let's see, we've got all kinds of great stuff in here and I can't ID most of it at this point. I think I even see some willow, I see elderberry, we have fringe cup down below. So there are entire planting plans within that you can find in the Portland metro area for native hedgerows. I will add some of those resources to you all when we send out our follow-up email after this class.
Thank you. Okay, so do we have any questions for Susie about hedgerows? Looks like we are slowing down here. We can use a hedgerow, create a hedgerow rain garden combo, and it's also a great oasis for birds that are migrating. So we don't have any questions. So we are going to now go into a recording on oak habitat by Nicole R. from the Clackamas Water Conservation District.
So some other types of habitat that you can actually build upon in your own yard included the Oregon white oak habitats. So some of you may have seen some of these beautiful native trees, Oregon white oaks. You might have them in your yard. They have lobed leaves and acorns, and they typically grow in a big umbrella shaped pattern in open areas, but sometimes a little bit taller and straighter. And the reason that we're talking about oak tonight is because these habitats are Oregon Conservation Strategy habitats of concern for the entire state, including some of the prairie and meadow habitats that you often see associated with oak. And less than 5% of these habitats remain, and most of those habitats, greater than 90%, are on private lands. So if you have one of these beautiful trees in your yard that's hundreds of years old, that is something to think about. Next slide. So I wanted to give you an idea of just how much of this habitat we have lost. This map here is giving you a graphic of the Willamette Valley. And the image on the left with all the colors is from the late 1800s, from some General Land Office data of vegetation at that time in the valley. And the yellow delineates grasslands, and then the brown are the oak woodlands. And then there's green and blue for riparian and wet habitats. And then if you look at the same graphic of the valley over on the right, that's from the mid 2000s, giving you an idea of what is left of those habitats in the valley. So this is kind of a grim outlook picture here, just letting you know that there's very little of that left. And if we have any of it at all, it's important to conserve it. But also in our yards, it's important to add, and I know that Anya brought that up as well, that there could be opportunities to plant oak and to provide meadows. Next slide. So it's good to understand why we even have oak around to begin with. Many of the trees that you see that are mature are hundreds of years old, and they've persisted with disturbance to allow for them to continue. And that has been mainly through burning practices by indigenous people in the valley. And they use those practices for a variety of reasons, like keeping the landscape open for hunting and providing food sources, including stimulating acorn production. And this is just giving you an idea of how these oak habitats are in a continuum of succession. So they kind of start in that grassland meadow type habitat, like a prairie, and they have very little canopy cover. And then as you move into a savanna, you'll see open habitats with wildflowers and grasses, but you'll have a few oak trees scattered in there. And then it moves up into a woodland or a mixed forest where you might have not just oak trees, but maybe some ash or cottonwood, or in some cases, some fir. Next slide. I wanted to give you some ideas of where these habitats are just outside your door. So one of you mentioned one of your favorite places is Camassia, and this is up here in the upper right. Camassia is in the Westland area. It's a nature preserve that is owned by the Nature Conservancy. And there's a nice field of camas there along with the oak woodland. And then just below the Camassia photo is a picture of the West Lynn oak savanna habitat, also in West Lynn off of the 205. And it's a pretty amazing spot just right there. And adjacent to there, there's just a variety of backyards. And one of them has an oak naturescaping yard. And then a big field of camas in Oregon City and a vernal pool habitat in Canby. Next slide. So why should we care about oak? Well, we're in here talking about gardening for wildlife, and Oregon white oak trees provide habitat for hundreds of species, including all of these taxa. I'm basically just listing some of the different species, some of which are obligate to Oregon white oak, which means that they have to have oak to persist, including the acorn woodpecker. You're familiar with woody woodpecker, and that is what is modeled after the acorn woodpecker. They're very social, they're in groups, and they use trees as granaries to stuff all their acorns for food sources. White-breasted nuthatches and gray squirrels, and then just a whole variety of invertebrates. And then what's really exciting too is you've also got all these diverse plants that are associated with oak and prairie communities. Next slide. So here's some nice pictures of some of those plants and species that you can find in these oak and prairie habitats, including the gray squirrel, our state bird, the western meadowlark, the nuthatch, a variety of different butterflies like the California sister, which only eats oak leaves. So we were talking about native species that require native plants to persist. Bender's blue butterfly and Kincaid's lupin. Some of you may know about that species. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned before, there's this really important cultural context to supporting these oak and prairie habitats. They wouldn't be here without Indigenous people keeping them around through burning practices and allowing for that natural disturbance that's needed to keep them there. And even today, we have some of them using and maintaining some of these habitats, just even in the greater Portland metro area. Next slide. So one thing that we've also tried to do in the greater Portland metro area, which includes part of Clark County, is we've been trying to figure out where our Oregon white oak trees are that are left over. So we knew they were around historically, but we wanted to know where are they now so we can figure out how to conserve them. So there was a big effort called Oak Quest that some of you may have been involved in. And that included having volunteers go out and just map where these mature Oregon white oak trees were, or entire canopies of the habitat were. So all these little blue dots are telling you where there are current Oregon white oak trees, which is pretty exciting because there really is a lot of that habitat still left to conserve. And there's quite a bit of it in the urban area, especially in North Clackamas County. Next slide. So how can you support Oregon white oak in your yard? Well, first of all, it's really important if you have one of these old mature oak trees to try to keep that tree standing if you can and support it as best you can. And one thing that's happened recently is with these ice storms that some of you may have experienced some damage to some of your trees, and Oregon white oak trees had quite a bit of damage, unfortunately, especially in Clackamas and Marion counties. And I encourage you that if you're able to keep that tree there, even if it doesn't look as nice anymore, if it's safe to keep it, wildlife will love it. One thing that's really important about oak trees is that they have very large limbs. When the limbs fall, it leaves a big hole often, and that sometimes is a big enough hole to provide a cavity for species that otherwise wouldn't have that cavity to nest in. The only way they can get those cavities sometimes is if they have a primary excavator, like affiliated woodpecker or northern flicker, create it for them. So oak trees are really important that way. It's important that you have oak trees or oak seedlings, that you release them or remove competing tree species from around them, because they grow slowly and they need lots of light. So they don't do well with competition, especially from fir trees. And then, like we talked about, invasive species are important to control around oaks, once again, because they're slow growing. And then I just wanted to mention that because there are a lot of efforts on oak conservation in the region, we put together an oak naturescaping guide for your urban and suburban backyards, and it is an excellent resource to check out if you're interested. And then we also have a meadowscaping guide for the region as well. So on the next slide, I'll show you links to those. Next. And we'll provide this in the email as resources, but I recommend you check these out, because what's nice is some of the questions you guys have been asking will be answered in these guides. The Metascaping Handbook gives you quite a bit of information on different site preparation techniques you can do to get your ground ready to plant. And it has some amazing resources of different plant species with pictures that you can put in your yard that are native. There's also some nice lists of nurseries that provide native plants like camas and seed. And the Oregon White Oak Guide we set up has a nice decision tree to help guide you through the whole process of oak naturescaping your yard. And also some of those similar resources, including a list of oak associated plants like shrubs and understory plants.
Great. Okay. So we have to hop back to the hedgerows for 1 second. And we have a question for Susie. Jennifer's wanting to know, she has a small area that might only be able to handle 3 large shrubs. Is it better for wildlife to plant 3 different types of shrubs, for instance, ocean spray, red flowering currant, and tall Oregon grape, or 3 of the same, or does it matter?
Oh, it's a great question. Well, wildlife and insects in particular, they prefer to have multiples of a resource around, not just one quick snack. So I would say that instead of thinking of just 3 of the same kind of shrub or 3 separate large shrubs, think about maybe going for some smaller to mid-sized shrubs. So things like snowberry or mock orange, depending on your habitat type. Things that may only at maturity grow to be about 3 or 4 feet tall, and do a variety of those in clusters.
Cool, thank you. Nicole, we had a question that from Aaron that wanted to know what caused such great loss of these oak habitats. And I know you answered in the chat, but would you like to share that with us?
Sure. Yeah, so oaks have been lost for a variety of reasons, but really many of them have been lost because they don't have that disturbance regime they need, like the burning practices. They've got fir encroaching on them or other faster growing species. But then the older oaks that had persisted many have been cut down for development and agriculture, just many reasons. And when you have those large trees where you're at, just remember that many of those trees have been around for a very long time. It's kind of exciting to think about. So good question.
Okay, that looks like the last of our questions. So we are on to Morgan with a live talk about creating wildlife habitat and dream habitats.
Yeah, and I know we're nearing the end of our time together, so I'm going to try to be quick, but we might be going 5 minutes over, just to let you know. So while creating a wildlife-friendly habitat requires various steps, including designing your habitat, project planning, implementation, and maintenance, we're really going to focus on the first step through an optional self-paced activity that you can do at home, involving conducting a site inventory in order to create a habitat map. But before we do that, let's talk about dream habitats. So part of a goal of the following activity that I'm going to go over, involving conducting that inventory of current site conditions, is to start brainstorming your dream habitat. In other words, your list. And Susie already talked about, inspiration. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about building your dream habitat. So think about, if money, time, and expertise were no object, what would you want in your ideal habitat? What wildlife are you trying to attract? So you think big. Later, you can narrow down what may be more reasonable or practical for you at that time. But for now, be creative. And then also remember that creating habitat is really a lifelong project and time commitment. So dare to dream. So now we're going to share the optional activity worksheets in the chat window. So if you can please open that up really quick and take a look so you can follow along. So between now and the second webinar on May 11th, again, these are optional activities that can help get you thinking about your property or your gardening project in more detail and the possibilities available to you. So you'll see on the first page that you're asked to draw a map of your habitat area. So that habitat area can be your entire property or just a small section. There are color coding suggestions for different site characteristics. Page 4 has a blank document you are welcome to use for your drawing, but if you prefer designing your map with the digital resources, feel free to do that. This is your map, so be creative however you wish. Page 3 is the National Wildlife Federation Certified Wildlife Habitat Checklist for our Garden for Wildlife program that you can use as a reference. This helps identify whether your habitat elements are meeting the requirements and which elements you have present and which areas you may need more improvement on. This will give you ideas of future projects for your dream habitat. And then following the drawing activity or the mapping worksheet, there's another activity called Who Can Live Here, which helps you spend some time focusing on one wildlife species that you would like to attract and researching what their needs are, including the native plant species it depends on. So we have a list of resources that may help you on the Association of Northwest Steelheaders Garden for Wildlife page. We'll put that in the chat too. And lastly, there's also a resource called 4-Season Habitat Planning. There's a chart that's useful for thinking about your to-do list throughout the year in order to develop or enhance your wildlife habitat projects. So these links, along with others and all the helpful guides that we mentioned tonight, we're going to share a Google Doc with all the references, all the links and guides, again, that we mentioned. And we'll also follow that up in the email that we'll send you after the webinar. Again, these are optional worksheets, and we just hope they'll be useful to add to your Gardening for Wildlife toolkit. Are there any questions about these? Okay, we're gonna.
Oh, okay. I think that's going to be it, except we have one more thing. Please complete the survey that we're going to be putting up. It's an anonymous survey. We're going to be putting up in the chat, I believe, or somewhere. And if you would like, if you're interested, you can put your email address on one of the first few questions to be in the running for this raffle prize. It's a lovely locally made mason bee box with a slate roof and an attic for the little mason bee cocoons, not cocoons, but little egg masses. And so please feel free to enter that, but know that if you do enter in the raffle, you have to come get it because this thing's going to be very heavy and we don't want to ship it. So that is our presentation for this evening. So once you've filled out the survey, we will love to see you next time on May 11th. Is that correct? May 11th.
May 11th at 6, yep.
At 6 o'clock. Don't miss it.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Do we have to hang on while they're doing their surveys?
Good night, everyone.
Amy? Good night. Amy, do we have to hang on while they're doing their surveys?
I think that
Or will you be able to get that if we close out?
Yeah, we can close out and I'll get it afterwards and let you know.
Okay.
I
Good night,
think we
everyone.
lose. I think we lose the access to the thing though. Can you hang on for another second?
Absolutely.
I was signed into my wrong account, so I don't have access to the feedback form.
No
Sorry, I'm
problem.
sorry.
No
No
worries.
problem.
Amy, share yes if they're automatically enrolled in the next session, and the answer is yes, right?
Yes, the answer is yes. Yes, if you enrolled for this class, then you should be in for the next one as well. And I'll send a reminder email probably the day before the next session, which will have the Zoom link, but it is the same Zoom link that you use for this class.
Maddie wants to know how to access the survey.
Oh, I will resend, but it's right here.
I
in the
also
chat.
earlier.
Okay.
And Amy, we are still meeting at 10 tomorrow, right?
Yes, 10 tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Great job.
Yeah, great job.
Thanks,
Everybody.
guys.
Thank you. That was super fun. I loved all of that.
Next class is going to be fantastic. That was good. That's going to be better. All right. I will make my exit. Thank
Me
you,
too.
everybody.
Good
Good
night.
night. Good night.